pleasure, my distinct pleasure, to introduce Professor Lily Gardner Feldman, whose work inspired this conference, I must say. She has been working on the issue of reconciliation for a long time, and has come out with a wonderful book. I have to get the title. I did read it. Germany's Foreign Policy of Reconciliation from Enmity to Amity. And Professor Feldman is the research director or the senior research fellow at the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at Johns Hopkins University. She also directs the Institute's Society and Culture and Politics program, and she has her PhD from MIT. Also, I wanted to say that she has written a very important article in Foreign Policy magazine last year, which is called "Reconciliation Means Having to Say You're Sorry." And in that article, she wrote about the lessons of Germany for Asia. And so she's not only an expert on Germany, she's an expert on reconciliation everywhere in the world, I think. And it's my great pleasure to have you here, Lily, and thank you so much for coming, and I'm looking forward to your keynote address.
Thank you very much. I'm short, but so is Bev, so this is at the right height, I think. I'd like first to thank Bev Crawford, Stephanie Kim, and Cavalier Carey for organizing these very rich and thoughtful presentations and discussions that we've had this morning. I think the first two panels were really excellent, and the discussants' comments. I think we have a lot of very important food for thought. So I'm very pleased that I was asked to be part of that, and want to thank the organizers for the very generous invitation. Let me see, should look at what the time is. The second thing I'd like to do is to note the pitfalls of writing one's remarks too far in advance. I wrote them last week before the trilateral summit that we didn't refer to this morning among China, Japan, and South Korea, with its joint declaration for peace and cooperation in Northeast Asia. I think this is has the potential to be an important movement forward, certainly institutionally. And also there was the bilateral summit between President Park and Prime Minister Abe. I think both of these events demonstrate the importance of the European experience as East Asia now builds out its own vision of regional cooperation. And in that joint declaration for peace and cooperation in Northeast Asia, coming to one of the most recent points in the discussion, it really does focus on both levels, on leadership and institutionalizing leadership exchanges, but also there's a whole area on civil society, people-to-people connections, including young people. It's like 55 points, I think, this declaration. It's huge, and it's worth reading if any of it happens. But it's, as a roadmap, I think it's very important. And the fact that this conference is sandwiched between last weekend's meetings and this weekend's meetings is fortuitous, but I think very good for us. Now, the conference seeks to learn for East Asian purposes, specifically from Germany's 7 decades experience with division, unification, and reconciliation. German officials and scholars have been reluctant to serve as a political and diplomatic model. They're very reluctant. They don't mind being an economic model, but when it comes to politics and diplomacy, they're much more skittish. That's begun to change. If you remember, Merkel had a few remarks to say in Japan about how Germany did reconciliation, and therefore really suggestions for what Japan could do. But it has, for the most part, there's reluctance. So it is, in fact, South Korea and China themselves who actively look to Germany. They praise Germany compared to Japan for facing up to its past and for creating practical mechanisms like bilateral textbook commissions, compensation, youth exchange. In its Northeast Asia Peace and Cooperation Initiative, South Korea leans directly on the Franco-German and European path in building a peace community. Park's Dresden Declaration that Steph referred to earlier, the Trust Politik, looks directly at Germany's unification experience, and she has very interesting discussion of wars, different kinds of wars. She also uses war to refer to the relationship with Japan. Now, Germany's unification experience is not referenced by officials, as far as I can tell, for cross-straits relations, but people have talked about it this morning. Although I think that could emerge at the official level from this meeting that's going to happen, I guess, is it Sunday, tomorrow? Because there is a new dynamic, there is a new potential, and in that setting, people do look at other alternatives, especially when there are very clear roadmaps in other cases. Now, the transference of models, I want to suggest, is very tricky. Comparing disparate examples makes us question our certitude and makes us be open to new ideas, but it should not render us forgetful of the unique contexts, histories, and cultures in individual cases. So we have to be careful when we make these comparisons. Now, this reluctance about borrowing, coupled with the messiness, complexity, and obstacles of Germany's path of unification and reconciliation, account for my title, Germany as Promising Lesson and Cautionary Tale. Germany's experience with division, unification, and reconciliation can be broken into 3 historical periods. In each, I try to specify the usefulness for East Asia, and here I will reference Japan, that Beverly noted was missing, especially now as it expresses, East Asia expresses its political will to advance institutionally. And as I traverse these 3 periods, I will also answer some of the conference organizers' questions about the linkage among the 3 phenomena, division, unification, reconciliation, and about the actors and domestic and international politics that serve as either stimuli or as obstacles. So period 1 stretches from 1949 until 1990, and it entailed the dominance of external reconciliation in the context of division, with a subtext of unification as a goal. Period 2 from 1990 until 2009 encompassed expanding external reconciliation in the context of formal unification and a new appreciation of internal reconciliation. Period 3 from 2009 through today is a time of new reconciliation challenges, externally and internally, in the context of East-West differences despite 25 years of formal unification. And I'd like to define my terms because we've been using these terms and I think perhaps we use them differently. So for me, division refers to nations existing as separate political entities, and that can be in many different forms, following war and marked by continuing antagonism. Unification is a political act to create one unit out of division. Like division, political and sovereignty-related unification is a terminal condition, whereas societal, economic, and cultural unification are ongoing processes. I'm coming back to this whole question of terminal condition versus, as you said, end state or end game. Reconciliation, and I take significantly Fanya's point about in the German-Israeli case at least, maybe the term is conciliation, but I'll still use reconciliation, is also a continuous process, taking 2 forms, external and internal. External or international reconciliation is the process of building long-term peace between former enemies through bilateral institutions across governments, and across societies. It is a mutual, interactive process involving the development of friendship, trust, empathy, and magnanimity, not necessarily forgiveness. Set in motion, and this is absolutely critical for a distinction between Germany and Japan, set in motion by an acknowledgement of and responsibility for historical facts. Reconciliation is lengthy, complex, and nonlinear, different in texture and intensity from the minimal definitions that some observers use, and those are peaceful coexistence, rapprochement, and normalization. One can distinguish then between expansive or full reconciliation and limited reconciliation. The full definition means the passage from enmity to amity. It's a big undertaking, but does not denote perfect peace and harmony. Rather, it integrates and manages differences in a cooperative framework. This gets back to this whole notion we don't need to love each other. We need to understand each other, and we need to understand the differences and be able to deal with them. Internal reconciliation, I believe, refers to two different processes. One that steadfastly confronts a history of violence and aggression, human rights violations and war crimes through commemoration, education, trials, legislation. And a second one, that absorbs lessons from history through new practices and policies of solidarity, tolerance, and diversity in a democratic framework. So let me come to the first period, and I'll say most about this because I think it's determinative. I'll focus on external reconciliation without suggesting reconciliation within West Germany wasn't important, but it did begin later. So we talk about silence in the 50s. Well, there wasn't silence if you looked at foreign relations dealing with the past. There may have been internally, but in any case, there were four key milestones, I think, for the internal process, four key milestones obtained for how West Germany collectively and internally as a society dealt with the past. The Ulm trials of the special commandos from the Nazi period, those trials in 1958, the Auschwitz trials of 1963, the 68 generations questioning of its parents, and the 1985 speech of President von Weizsäcker. All of these events dealt with, as did the events of external reconciliation I'm about to describe, with the acknowledgement of atrocities, guilt, responsibility, and truth-telling. And I would say in East Asia, this is the basic ingredient that's missing, where recognition of and apologies for historical aggression have been spotty at best. They've been incomplete. And in this trilateral declaration, you will note, history issues were completely glossed over. It was a very practical, forward-oriented document. And in the trilateral, it only appeared as a commitment to talk more and with greater speed about the so-called comfort women issue. It wasn't a resolution of the issue. So what I'm saying from the German case is that reconciliation integrates history rather than forgetting it, which sometimes is the reality in East Asia, specifically in Japan. Now, East Germany obviously pursued a different path, identifying itself as the political alternative to historical fascism, with no particular responsibility to specific victims such as Jews. And externally, Israel was seen as an illegitimate outpost of Western imperialism. And Poland and Czechoslovakia were considered brothers as long as they didn't question communism. In this period through 1990, there are two main phases determined by the international context and domestic politics, with the dividing line forming in the mid-1960s. I label the first phase the nature of reconciliation in the shadow of the Cold War, enduring patterns, because I do believe the framework that was set then has continued to today. Now, four conditions surrounded German foreign policy in its constitutive phase after 1949: an undemocratic past, the recent history of military aggression and the Holocaust, a divided nation in a divided Europe, and the Cold War involving the Soviet threat and German dependence on the US. So here, making a connection among these different phenomena, division determined a process that became expansive reconciliation with former enemies in the West, but resulted in a situation of very limited reconciliation, that is, peaceful coexistence, with former victims in Eastern Europe and with East Germany. I believe that full and limited reconciliation in the European context, at least, contributed to stability. So I guess differ from Bev. Now, Chancellor Adenauer recognized that German international rehabilitation required, both pragmatically and morally, a two-pronged reconciliation strategy with France on the one hand, the Paris Treaties of 1954, the Zara Agreement of 1955, and with Israel, the Reparations Agreement of 1952. Now, in East Asia, debates, I think, are couched almost exclusively in pragmatic terms and not in moral terms, at least not by all the parties. The other point I would make about this period of time, France and Israel took the political initiatives. If you want to know where these policies came from that Germany then committed itself to, the initiatives were taken by the victims. And I think this is not well understood in East Asia. And Merkel made that point in Japan. She made 4 different statements about reconciliation. She said, I'm not here to lecture, but if you want to listen, I'll tell you what happened. And she emphasized the outstretched arm of the victims. And Gauck in Korea, just a few weeks ago, to the National Assembly, made the same point. You know, we were lucky. People were willing to deal with us. So I think that's a very important point. That may have changed recently. It'd be interesting to know how important Park's role was in an overture to Abe. I'm not sure how it all unfolded. It's too close to tell, but it wouldn't surprise me if she hadn't shown some initiative in doing that. Reconciliation as a goal for Germany was formalized and institutionalized, I can't stress that enough, in the 1963 Élysée Treaty with France and in the 1965 diplomatic recognition of Israel. Defense and economic institutions were key before and after those agreements. Now, in East Asia, there are limited bilateral institutions, although, again, this could change because of this trilateral development. And I think we need to remember here why there were no diplomatic relations with Israel until 1965. Why did it take so long? Well, that gets back to the point made this morning, that gets back to the Hallstein Doctrine and the Alleinvertretungsanspruch. Germany feared that if it recognized Israel, the Arab world would recognize the GDR, and then Germany would have to cut off relations with the Arab world, which meant all kinds of economic losses. So for that reason, and that's an example where pragmatism trumped, you would have imagined that after the Holocaust, recognizing Israel should have been a no-brainer, but it wasn't. Now, the governmental activity that I've suggested was preceded by initiatives from a range of civil society actors, referring again to what Fania said earlier. Religious groups, friendship associations, youth and cultural exchange, scientists, trade unions, economic ties, town twinnings. Now, in East Asia, civil society connections, certainly in Japan, are anemic. And even when they're there, they're fragmented. And I think that's a problem that they're fragmented because it limits the capacity to make overtures to the other side. It also limits one's capacity to influence one's own government. One needs a critical mass of civil society actors to be able to forcefully say what a position is and for a government to listen. Again, change may be possible because in this trilateral declaration, as I said. There's a whole section about people-to-people exchanges, mentioning most of the things that I said about Germany. We'll see if it happens, but at least the intention is there. Now, domestically, there was opposition to Adenauer's France-oriented strategy of German rearmament and integration into the West, and to his reparations agreement with Israel. Again, you can say, how was that possible? 7 years after the end of the Holocaust, how could Germans be objecting? German politicians, Adenauer's own finance minister, German public opinion was against the reparations agreement. But what's key here is that Adenauer's leadership and vision enabled him to face the opposition, commencing a tradition of courage extending to Merkel. And I think Eric's chart placing these different leaders is very useful, and it's complete. They all have some relationship to memory, even if it's some less than more, but it's all there. In East Asia, I think this dimension of personal courage, that's what I'm talking about, and it's not just on the part of Germans, but on the part of their partners. And personal courage to take on the opposition is largely lacking, and one sees this particularly in Japan. What also is lacking is the close personal relationships that German leaders developed with the partners. I could give you could give you a number of examples of very positive relations based on good personal chemistry, starting in the 50s through Merkel today. Now, in terms of the international environment, the US was actively behind Adenauer's policies. In East Asia, we know that the US didn't actively encourage reconciliation for Japan in the early years. Indeed, some say it hindered it. Or it was constrained by the fact of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and had no moral authority to be talking about other people reconciling. This has begun to change, including the US role in urging the recent bilateral and trilateral meetings, but as part of a united front against North Korea and a China containment strategy. So again, we need to look at the motives for why countries are taking these new positions. And then the multilateral European Community framework was indispensable for Franco-German reconciliation and also useful for German-Israeli ties. Now, the sui generis supranational European Union cannot be replicated in East Asia, clearly. But the nascent free trade talks among China, Japan, and Korea that were resuscitated last week as part of these trilateral efforts are promising. They had been suspended for 3.5 years because of the differences over history issues. They could provide the necessary multilateral framework to begin to bind the countries. And the more general trilateral is also important in that context. Both are expressions of rapprochement and normalization, to use Abe's term. So the Cold War and Adenauer's anti-communism precluded the evolution of reconciliation policies with Poland and with Czechoslovakia, but some reconciliation elements became possible under Adenauer's successor, which takes me to the second stage in this first period, which is the second stage is détente and new opportunities within limits. So developments in this phase of division would later help shape the reality of unification and the nature of reconciliation that ensued. In the 1960s, Germany pursued a domestically contested, again, policy of small steps and change through rapprochement. Those were the terms that were used. That became the essence of Ostpolitik, or normalization, another term that was used, through treaties with East Germany, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, and the beginning of détente with the Soviet Union, involving political recognition and economic concessions in exchange, especially in the East German case, for human and family contexts. In the Polish and Czech cases, Germany also acknowledged its crimes. And so we have the 1965 Treaty on Basic Relations between South Korea and Japan. We have the 1972 communique between Japan and China as part of so-called normalization. But South Korea and China quite vehemently disagree with the Japanese view that those agreements satisfied the compensation issues. So it's a very different attitude again, or framework between Germany and East Asia. Now, in the German case, religious connections, starting already in the 1950s, asserted themselves in the 60s in the written exchanges of the Polish Catholic bishops to their German counterparts, offering forgiveness for Germany's wartime crimes and asking for forgiveness for expelling Germans from the area that became Poland after World War II. And West German Protestant organizations now accepted the finality of division and of territories lost to Poland. These initiatives constituted an important impetus for the government's recognition de facto, not de jure, of the German-Polish border in the 1970 treaty. Brandt, in his memoirs, really emphasizes this. This was also made possible Brandt's iconic kneeling at the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial, something we haven't seen again by a Japanese leader in East Asia. I mean, people like Hatayama have tried to do this, but not as prime minister. What this implies, this de facto recognition for East Asia, is that territorial issues can be managed without full legal resolution. Already in 1972, following the Normalization Treaty, Germany and Poland set up a joint textbook commission. Although the recommendations were criticized in Germany and Poland, nonetheless a process of dialogue had begun, similar to the Franco-German talks, and it had begun during communism and was a model for other German-Polish civil society interactions. The East Asia reference here, school books, as you know, the content of school books represents a major area of disagreement between China and Japan, Japan and South Korea. There have been joint efforts by historians in East Asia, but they don't have the united, consistent endorsement of governments as they have had in the German case. By the early 70s, Czechoslovakia, as you know, was hermetically sealed after the demise of the Prague Spring, and thereby robbed of the foundational underpinnings of reconciliation that were present in the German-Polish case. There is another point I want to mention about this period. In communist Poland and Czechoslovakia of the 1980s, the dissident communities actually called for German unification, which was a very courageous thing to do at the time, but in an all-European framework. These dissidents, like Havel and Mazowiecki, became the holders of power with the collapse of communism. Therefore, their logical endorsement lent crucial international approval to the unification process early on. Opposition then to division, or opposition during division, actually determined the success of political unification. Now, by 1989, Franco-German and German-Israeli reconciliations were advanced institutionally at all societal and governmental levels. Crises still punctuated relations occasioned by domestic politics and international circumstances, including over unification itself in 1989-1990, when both President Mitterrand and Prime Minister Shamir were initially opposed. However, due to the decades of governmental and societal reconciliation habits, concerns were quickly overcome. Here, then, reconciliation enabled and shaped unification. The second period from 1990 until 2009, highlighting external reconciliation, unification and the end of the Cold War made the full flowering of reconciliation with Poland possible. The 1990s were the golden years in terms of creating bilateral societal and governmental institutions in many areas based on the 1991 Good Neighborliness Treaty of a united Germany and Poland, following many Franco-German examples, and once more mixing pragmatic and moral motives on both sides. Now, regarding East Asia, I think we could question, is there now a new possibility for such a concept of good neighborliness after Abe's 70th anniversary speech and after the trilateral summit and the bilateral summit between Presidents Park and Abe last Monday. History didn't disappear in the golden years with Poland. There were crises over expulsion and restitution and reparations, but the thing was that there was a cooperative framework now in which to manage those differences. Germany finally removed the border issue with Poland through the de jure recognition of the Oder-Neisse line, although domestic politics in Germany meant this happened after unification and not before, which had been Poland's preference. Poland wanted to make it a condition of unification. And the implication for East Asia, international legal resolution can take a long time, but before it happens, there doesn't have to be a disruptive element to territorial disputes if there is a broad panoply of relations. And I think that's one of the reasons that the territorial issues come so quickly and quite violently to the agenda in East Asia, because there aren't other sets of relations to act as shock absorbers, if you like, or as buffers. Now, the process of institutionalization was much slower with Czechoslovakia than Czech Republic than it was with Poland, because you didn't have this foundation that occurred during the process of division. And even today, there are agreements to disagree between Germany and the Czech Republic on a variety of issues, including on the 1938 Munich Agreement and on issues of compensation. Czech membership of the EU, like Polish membership, meant a new agenda, and in both cases, Germany had been a key advocate, and once again, as with France and Israel, bilateral reconciliation, this reconciliation after unification, was housed in a multilateral framework, and that is essentially missing in such intensity and form in East Asia. Unification and the end of the Cold War permitted new forms of societal and governmental institutions in Franco-German and German-Israeli relations, for the new Germany wanted to prove that it was trustworthy. This bigger Germany needed to demonstrate that it could be trusted. And its partners were keen to embed it anew in deep structures. Institutional deepening did not preclude disagreements, but resulted in more channels for airing, containing, or resolving them. Now, by 2009, all of Germany's external practices of reconciliation with former enemies were deep, intense, and extensive. Already by 1991, the Eastern and Western reconciliation processes were combined in the so-called Weimar Triangle among Germany, Poland, and France, which could be a model for the new East Asian plan, again, suggested last weekend. By 2009, Germany's various reconciliations, despite all the disagreements and crises, could be characterized by the terms friendship and mutual trust. These are not the terms that one would use for German-German reconciliation or the process of unification. Unification transformed what had been an external situation of minimal reconciliation, peaceful coexistence, into now a process of internal reconciliation, expressed as both facing the past, this time the past of the GDR state and its offenses, and the issue of solidarity between West and East. In the latter case of unification, developments are relevant for inner-Korean relations. That's already been spoken about, so I don't want to take a lot of time doing it. I had a whole section, but I'll leave it out, except to say that, of course, Germany and South Korea concluded two formal arrangements to consider internal, they did it in 2010, and foreign policy in 2014, lessons for Korea. They've together work on these issues in a formal way. And President Park, as we've said, drew conclusions in her Dresden speech for Nordpolitik, policy towards North Korea, family reunions, people-to-people contacts, infrastructure development in the North. Analyses of German unification's applicability for Korea focus on three issues: the conditions under which it happened, unification's actual extent, how much has it really happened, apart from the formality, and thirdly, the cost. And I was going to go into all of those, but I won't. So let me come to the third period, 2009 to the present. There are now new external relations with Greece, and Eric mentioned that this morning, relations with Greece and Russia, where both countries have played the history card against Germany, and internal challenges, the refugee crisis. East Germans differ on the reactions to Russia compared to West Germany. 42% want sanctions against Russia rolled back compared to only 26% in West Germany. Support in East Germany for the anti-EU Alternative for Germany and the anti-immigrant Pegida group that was mentioned in the last session is accompanied by recent polling differences on questions regarding refugees. Germany's liberal asylum laws, as I'm sure you know, are a direct response to the closed and racist Nazi system. 59% of East Germans worry that so many refugees are coming to Germany, compared to 48% in West Germany. 45% of East Germans polled thought immigration provides more disadvantages than advantages, compared to 29% in West Germany. About 60% of the attacks, and I think that also came out in the chart that was on the board, 60% of the attacks against refugees have occurred in East Germany. Again, we have to be very careful with public opinion, but it seems that there are disparities in all areas of German unification. There are three lessons for East Asia that I would suggest for this period. Reconciliation is a never-ending process, and old history can appear at any time. Secondly, unification is a long process, and economic disparities have sharp societal and political ramifications. And unification and internal reconciliation never cease posing questions about identity, belonging, and the meaning of nation. Let me now conclude. First, active and stabilizing reconciliation occurred in unification's absence. Indeed, division made it an imperative. Secondly, division influenced with whom and with which means Germany could reconcile in the West and in the East. External reconciliation in its minimal and full forms was necessary for unification. The fourth point I'd make is that the structural fact of unification and changes in the international order expanded existing forms and introduced new partners in external reconciliation, but in the long term produce new challenges in internal and international reconciliation. The fifth point I would make, contention, whether in domestic politics or in the bilateral relationships, is a feature of reconciliation, which is then authenticated in the process of surmounting the obstacles. Sixth point I would make, internal reconciliation in the process of unification manifested as solidarity and diversity and tolerance is being sorely tested today in the refugee crisis, demonstrating that external shocks cannot always be anticipated. The human crisis is challenging the very values for which the European project, and Germany as its key member, stands. Acknowledgement of history, political leadership, civil society initiatives, institutionalization, supportive regional and international frameworks are all essential elements of Germany's international reconciliation. I would submit that all are fragile developments in East Asia. But apart from the history issue, which is not being talked about and is the most difficult issue, particularly because of Japan, but not only, there is now the recognition that those other four essential elements are ingredients, and they're all mentioned in this trilateral declaration. So finally, Germany can be an inspiration and a promising lesson for East Asia in the practical mechanisms crafted for external reconciliation, but it's a cautionary tale about the costs, human and material, of internal reconciliation as unification, and about the reality of unintended consequences.
Wonderful. And we have some time for a few questions and comments, and Professor Tang has been chomping at the bit here.
I really enjoy your speech, and I've been pondering whether a comparison between the present situation in East Asia will be much more similar to the situation before the World War II Europe. I'll just give you some keywords: arms races, for instance, nationalism, anti-status quo stance, for instance, Versailles and Japanese security law, and so on. And also the denial of the war crime. By that time, I mean, in the 30s, the Germans also denied. That's why the Versailles Treaty was abandoned by the Germans, by the Hitler, and the rise of China and the rise of China and the rise of Germany by that time. And not to forget, and also a very, very important point is the role of the United States. Germans, I mean the Nazis, have killed 6 million of the Jewish people. And the role of the Jewish, I mean the Jewish people in the United States. And then the United States, the relationship between the United States and Germany by that time. This is actually the constellation in German and US relationship. But in China or in East Asia, it's totally different. Japan has never declared war against China or against Korea. They declared war only on the United States and the West European or the European states. So how could they, I mean, in a position to excuse themselves? Because by that time, the constellation is totally different. Their ideas are totally different. They just try to bring the prosperity to all these people, in Asia. They try to give them a lesson and try to rescue them from the colonization of the Western colonizers. Yeah, that was the conception from the Japanese. And after the Cold War, I mean, after the Korean War started, how can Japanese find a counterpart to excuse themselves for? No connections to China, and so on. I mean, there's nobody for the Japanese to excuse themselves. So to do apology to. So that's why I would say the situation is very much different. But if we compare the present situation or present status quo situation in East Asia, I see much more parallels to the to European situation or to Europe before the Second World War. So I would say that's actually what we have to do to prevent kind of conflict by the bilateral or multilateral confidence-building measures and so on. So this is my point, my comments to your speech. Yeah, but I enjoy your speech very much. Again.
Thank you, Professor Tang. I would like to collect a couple of questions and then see what are there any more? Yes, Steph Haggard.
So this was really a wonderful piece of a wonderful speech. I mean, I thought you summarized both of the regions very well. I just want to raise two little complexities about the East Asian cases that I think differ from the European context. One is that Japan has in fact made a number of apologies, dozens of them. And I think those apologies, in fact, are quite eloquent, and they probably reflect the majority view of many Japanese. They've been undermined by the tolerance of deniers and indiscipline within the LDP. So I mean, we know that story. But one thing I don't think that got adequate attention in your remarks is the complexities raised by China's history. Because from 1991 on, it's built a national narrative which just makes absolutely no sense for where China is right now, which is that it's a victim. And this victim narrative is being transmitted to youth. It's being picked up by popular culture, and Japan is the target of it. And so I think part of Japan's reaction to the apology wars has to do with the question of whether any final resolution can actually be made if the government on the mainland is partly building an ideological edifice which targets itself as a victim of this past aggression in perpetuity. And if you've seen some of the museums in China, they look like Holocaust museums. And this goes to the textbooks and memorials and so on and so on. And of course, China is virtually silent on its own internal history, in which tens of millions of people were killed in the Great Leap and in the Cultural Revolution. So I think this makes it difficult to have honest conversations in the region on both sides.
Thank you, Steph. One more question. Louis.
A point that you didn't have time. A point that you didn't have time for, that I think often comes to mind on a much more simple level than some of the sophisticated critique of and questions just now, is the reconciliation of North and South Korea in comparison to East and West Germany, and it's the cost. And one, just on a simple level, imagines reconciliation, but always imagines something comparable to the $80 billion, I believe it was, that is mentioned in terms of West German expenditure to absorb, more. And it would be interesting if you could mention, because the disparity of economies is probably a little bit greater between South and North in the case of Korea, and the amount of money to bring Korea up to any kind of standard over the next couple decades, it just seems unbelievably large.
Okay, to start with Lewis's point, the cost has been estimated for German unification at between $1.2 trillion and $2 trillion. Much more than anticipated. The cost for the Korean government's estimate is $500 billion over 20 years, which has been deemed low by most analysts. So the cost issue is a big issue. The disparity, the population disparity, is obviously, East Germany in that sense was more digestible in quotation marks. The population was 1/4 the size of West Germany, whereas I guess North Korea represents half of the South Korean population. Is that correct? Yeah. I'm sorry. It's hard to, maybe if you have the mic, it would be easier. Sorry. So just, it's easier to, because I can't somehow. Okay, so and the economic disparities and the disparities in taste and culture, they're all very real. We don't have time to go into them, but you're right. The cost issue is a big issue. On Steph's question, I think I said they were spotty, the apologies, suggesting that it wasn't, that there haven't been apologies. And I think it's very important for Koreans and for Chinese to recognize that there have been apologies. The problem is they think those apologies are inadequate. And what I've argued is, in the German case, there weren't always formal apologies. They found other ways of saying things that were acceptable to the other partner or to the victim. And
the point is compensation.
I'm sorry?
The point is compensation.
Well,
it's different.
No, it's not, because, look, legally, Germany had no obligation to pay reparations to Israel. The state of Israel did not exist at the time of the crimes. It was a moral decision with pragmatic elements. And Germany, which is always vaunted for its legal approach, on a number of occasions on compensation issues, took extra legal measures to solve the problem. So what I'm saying is, you know, with the apology, you can have the absence of a formal apology and still have compensation. The German case demonstrates that. So, but the point that you raise more important, I mean, and you did have courageous people like Murayama, like Kono, Hatayama, you know, at the beginning of his prime ministership, had a very different view of reconciliation. You did have, but the problem is, first, the other side sees it as inadequate. That's problematic on their part. But secondly, in the German case demonstrates that apology, whatever you want to call it, I call it acknowledgement, so that it's not such a restrictive term, has to be accompanied by many other things. That's just the first stage. It's not, well, we made this apology, now we're done. Now we're reconciled. That's not what reconciliation is all about. So I would say, I agree with you, it's more complex in terms of the apologies. On the history issue, first I'll take the second point you made about China's internal history and its need to face its own history. I agree with you completely, but that shouldn't be tangled up in relations between Japan and China. The first issue you mentioned, how it portrays Japanese history and Japanese aggression towards China, you're suggesting is done in a way that isn't necessarily helpful because it's only victimhood, and it's quintessentially victimhood, and a kind of victimhood that doesn't leave any openness to the other side. So I think you have to make a distinction between the internal argument and the question of dealing with Japan. I think those are separate. And on your question, which is a very difficult question, I think the comparison would be worthwhile, but I think it's very difficult because when we're talking about comparing, you know, Germany and Japan, you know, we do have a good starting point after 1945. They were both pariah nations, and one of them has emerged as an accepted regional and global leader, and one is not a regional or global leader, largely because of the history questions. So I think the comparison, there are differences, but you know, I think you needed the fact of the Holocaust and the nature of not just the Holocaust, the nature of the aggression and the occupations that Germany perpetrated to get us to a stage where we really can talk about these issues. I don't think we had that after World War I. I think the Holocaust and World War II were so devastating and so horrific, not to say not all war is, but that led to a certain framework that allowed us to talk about these issues. And one of the major developments, and we've all been speaking about this, is institutions. You had the League of Nations, which was a very weak institution, and you know, Japan left it. Countries left it. It's not the same today with the East. We don't have enough institutions in Asia, but people aren't leaving institutions. They tend to be creating institutions, whether it's the Development Bank or what might come out of this trilateral effort. So I would feel more comfortable with the comparison today, but I'd be interested in your exploring the other comparison.
Just one sentence. Germany has been defeated twice, but Japan only once.
So does Japan have to be defeated again?
Yeah, I can say that. But maybe.
And by who? And by whom?
I don't know.
Well, who knows? You know, there are funny things going on now. I mean, it would take a while to see these two events, these two bookends of these meetings, I think are potentially game-changing for a long-term process. Nothing's going to come easily, but it's almost a conceptual or paradigm change in the way people are thinking about the region that I think could lead somewhere. It needs a lot of coaxing, and people have to know that there are concrete benefits that can come from this. So the pragmatism is again important. Sorry.
Let's thank Lily again and thank all of you for your good questions.